Welcome everyone to the first week of lectures in Geography 4880. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to divide Thursday's lectures into 5 mini lectures, the first one of which will be about classical geography. Remember, the theme of the entire week is geography before 1930. So we've got 75 minutes ahead of us, and a lot of content to cover, a lot of ground, a lot of years before 1930s. So let's go ahead and jump in. We are asking ourselves, how and why did geography emerge? We'll be looking at geography through history and not shying away from its disturbing associations with colonialism, imperialism, and other nefarious forces in our world. We will look at the institutionalization and diversification of contemporary geography a bit later in the lectures today. We are obviously going to spend a lot more of the course on contemporary geography in its diverse forms, but I do need to sort of preview that for you. And in particular, we'll be looking at questions around the philosophy of science, a bit more of that. On Tuesday, we ask questions like, what is a theory? What is a concept? And we'll get into a little bit more of that. That's going to be helpful for us throughout the course. We'll be doing that today. Reminder that this week we are looking at chapters 1 through 3 in the text. I made an announcement on CourseLink that tells you a little bit more about how to access those chapters. The themes or sort of key messages from this week are the following. So what we're going to see as we look at key thinkers in geography over time before 1930 are these following debates or points. We're going to see some thinkers emphasize general forms of geographical knowledge, such as distances, sort of abstract numbers that relate to measurement that's, we can calculate about the Earth's surface, as well as particular forms of geographic knowledge about particular places, portraits of specific areas. That tension within geography between making general knowledge and making particular descriptions of places is inherent to the discipline, really. We can see it from thousands of years ago. We'll also see continuing and evolving discussions about the relationship between human and natural worlds. Key question in geography has always been how people make the world into their home, how the natural landscape is transformed into a cultural one. And we'll see that context matters to the production of geographical knowledge. We'll see how key thinkers have been under the employ or at least influenced by empires, states, companies, and the growth of mercantilism. And that has all influenced what people have been able to say and what they've focused on in their research. So we'll start here. This is something the Canadian Association of Geographers, the CAG, put out a few years ago. That tells us what geography is, or gives us some examples. It's economic change and livelihoods in the global south, visiting the Arctic to study global climate change, using technology to analyze global environmental change, exploring the transmission of flamenco culture in the global economy. They sum it up as geography is the science of place, space, and environment. Each place on Earth is distinguished by a unique mix of natural resources, cultural practices, and economic and political systems. Geographers study what makes each place unique and connections and interactions between places. There's a lot embedded in that statement in terms of particular views on what geography is. We will see very similar definitions and perspectives as we look to geographers from thousands of years ago, okay? This is what we describe geography as today here at Guelph, okay? So if you look at some of our material on the website, we use terms like diverse, multi-method, interdisciplinary, applied, and critical, okay? And these are all apt descriptors of what we do in geography, but where did these come from? We can't understand a contemporary place without understanding some of its history. We can't understand wealth without understanding its long history of inhabitants and physical geography, glaciation. Just as we can't do that, we can't understand modern geographical theory without understanding where it came from. That is asking questions like, or understanding that people have been asking questions like, how is human life related to the natural world? What are the significant differences between places? How is the particular related to the general and universal? These are what your textbook refers to as profound questions that geographers have been asking for all of time. We'll start here, and it is just one place to start, okay? And this is one of those tens of thousands, at least 10,000 years ago, cave dwelling people inscriptions. And in fact, archaeologists have described this as a map that people have made. So in many ways, of course, the first geographers were people living long ago. It wasn't some big scientist or theory head a couple hundred years ago. It was ordinary people making maps of the world around them, trying to understand and make sense of the world around them. But of course, most of the times we start our description of the history of geography with the Greeks, who have the best records available to us now for describing geography from the ancient past. And the Greeks were concerned in classical times specifically with a couple of different things. Topographical description, okay, which we could think of as a sort of particular or specific approach to geography, describing specific places. And we saw in our textbook the Greek philosopher Herodotus really emphasizing that with his descriptions of places in the Mediterranean and the Greek Empire, as well as some Greek philosophers focusing more on questions of measurement. How do we understand the surface, measure the surface of the earth? So we saw Eratosthenes as an example of that. And we know, both from the textbook as well as from 2480, that Eratosthenes was the first to come up with a pretty good measurement of the circumference of the earth. So here we already see that split between general geography, focused on measurements that could be applied anywhere and coming up with latitude and longitude and doing maps, and in particular geography, focused on describing specific places, okay? And of course, these were philosophers, so they're going beyond just map making and really thinking deeply about the origins and meaning of nature. But they're not separate from questions of the Greek Empire and its expansion at that time, okay? And in fact, they were working in many cases in the service of it, okay? If the Greek Empire is interested in expanding, it might want to know, well, what are these places that we are expanding into like? Okay, so in many ways, this is the first time we see geographers employed in the service of militaries and states and in power, okay? And this is something that won't go away, as we'll see. So geography, one of the earliest sciences. It emerged from people's basic curiosity, fear of what's around them, attempt to understand what's around them, often driven by means of or motives of empire and economy, to discover new territory, resources, and power. People were using maps, making maps, cataloging, writing accounts of other peoples and cultures, okay? But this was mainly, at least in classical times, practiced by explorers, wealthy individuals who had the time to travel and see the world and write accounts of different places, okay? As well as bureaucratic managers and colonial mercantilists, as we'll see in just a second when we move, especially into the age of exploration. But to stick with classical geography, some of our biggest names in philosophy could be considered geographers. Plato, for instance, came up with this way of understanding or describing different forms of space and place, okay? So kanon, the homogeneous and undifferentiated void in which all other things exist, the sort of abstract space, as we'll hear it called in just a few minutes. or Cartesian space. Okay, out of that void, out of Canaan, comes Korah, places in the process of becoming. Okay. Now note that this is actually the root for choropleth. So again, to go back to 2480, if any of you remember that term, choropleth, okay, the root there is region, okay, place, and pleth just is Greek for magnitude. So when we make a choropleth map, we're making a map of magnitudes of something, some phenomenon in a place or region. And Plato also really emphasized the idea of topos, a place that is an actually accomplished place, not in the process of becoming a place, but actually settled and fully, something we can fully describe. And indeed, for Aristotle, place took precedent over all other things. Now, moving forward in the classical period, Roman geographers, okay, were also very important. So Strabo, associated with the Roman Empire, okay, writing at the time that the Roman Empire was moving from the Republic into the Empire, okay, and Strabo found himself in the employ of the Empire, describing other cultures and countries, but trying to synthesize those into an understanding of the interactions between places, okay, to go back to this CAG definition of geography. Okay, geographers are interested not just in understanding what a specific place is all about, but understanding the interactions between them. We see that 1,000, 2,000 years ago already. Ptolemy, to look more at the general side of geography, at this time was writing his guide to geography, and in particular contributing to cartography by coming up with a way of measuring coordinates on the surface of the Earth and plotting them out in 2D. That is, coming up with a system of latitude and longitude. Now, as we move into the so-called Dark Ages or medieval period, and of course, it's important to note here that for the most part, our emphasis is on the Western development of geography, okay, Western European development of geography, as opposed to indigenous or other regional or cultural formations of geography. As we move into the medieval period in Western Europe, we see the church, the Catholic Church, coming to dominate, okay? Scripture is privileged over science, and so geography becomes used to reinforce church power. So we see maps like the Map Mundi in the lower right-hand corner here that posits Jerusalem as at the center of the world, okay? And we don't see a whole lot of development of geographical science during this period otherwise. Instead, key developments in geography take place in the Middle East, okay? We have Al-Idrisi's map making and descriptions of the world, one of which is in the lower left-hand corner here. Okay, what's in the upper left-hand corner is just a map of the plague that plagued Western Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries. Ibn Khaldun was an important Middle Eastern geographer writing at about this time, who sought to come up with a theory of history as it relates to geography. His idea was that social cohesion was the engine of history by which civilizations rose and fell, and that social cohesion was a product of the dynamic between, as he posited, towns and countryside, or cities and the desert in the Middle East context, okay? And so the dualism or dynamic between people moving to cities and losing social cohesion, that dynamic was really what he saw as, that geographic dynamic is what he saw as driving the rise and fall of civilization. So an important geographer at this time. Now, during the age of navigation, a so-called age of discovery, which of course wasn't really a period of discovery. It was a period of Western Europeans discovering places unknown to them, but clearly not places unknown to anyone, okay? Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and the Western Hemisphere clearly knew about where they lived before Western Europeans. But during this time in Western Europe, it was focused on exploration informed by classical geography and cartography. This is a rebirth or revival of classical works such as those from Ptolemy or Strabo. And voyages that Western Europeans took and the facilitated scientific investigation, generation of more geographic knowledge, different kinds of projections, map making efforts, as well as territorial claims. So we see things like this, where maps become used to facilitate, enhance colonial power. They illustrate, communicate, and claim New World territory for European countries by marking out which powers will become dominant in an area. These maps usually leave off indigenous people and resource uses. They literally write them off the map, okay? And that served to create physical space, legal legitimization for European newcomers and capitalists. Just as an example, we look to British Columbia and the map-making efforts that happened there. Map-making served to create reserves that contained indigenous peoples, defining where they could live, where they could harvest, terms of citizenship and property ownership. Okay, geographers, cartographers, the maps they made facilitated colonialism. Now, at this time, geography is gaining renown as one of several distinct sciences. Okay, so we see even some of the most well-known scientists of all time, like Isaac Newton, teaching geography, okay, in part because geography was known as a kind of related to physical sciences at that time, okay. So, during this period, the so-called Enlightenment, we see key figures such as Francis Bacon, René Descartes, Galileo emerge. Descartes is who will give name to Cartesian space, sort of abstract, gridded, empty space, okay, that we will continue to talk about. We also see Berenius at this time as one of the first to really inspire a more modern definition of geography as the discipline of the earth. And he also split it up into general geography and special geography. Special geography being the kind of geography that focuses on describing particular places. General geography being that which aims for more universal laws that can be applied anywhere on the planet. Okay, his focus though was still on describing what the world is all about rather than explaining it. Okay, so here's what he had to say about general geography. He sort of dismissed special geography. Those who have written about geography have really focused in on special geography, and they've really forgotten to look at this general geography. And without looking at general geography, without doing that, we can't barely even call geography a science. Okay, so he was skeptical of that and really wanted to push forward the idea of geography, and general geography in particular, in order to ensure geography status as a science. And we'll leave it at that for this first mini lecture. In the next mini lecture, we'll dive right into what we could say is the birth or the beginning of modern geography in its different forms. And we'll review key thinkers who have come to define and shape modern geography up to 1930.